Happy spooky season everyone, I wish you good scares and tasty treats. So I was recently watching a couple of horror movies, namely The Babadook and The Conjuring 2, and it struck me how wildly different they ended up being, not just in terms of the type of horror movie they were, but in how scary they were and how long they remained as such. And this got me thinking, what actually makes horror work? Like, as a medium, what is that all-important secret ingredient that makes one thing scary and another thing not? Well, I'm nothing if not willing to inflict my every last passing thought onto my audience, so let's talk about that for a bit, shall we? What is it that makes horror work? I could start by defining horror, explaining the genre conventions to you and all those other things that a really good video essayist would do, but can I be honest, I really don't want to. We all know what horror is. It's the genre preeminently defined by its desire to provoke a fear-based emotional reaction out of you, most often by violating the sense of reality that we as viewers have come to rely on in our day-to-day lives. Whether it's via the supernatural, like monsters or ghosts or the devil himself, or by an examination of society and exploring how actually kind of fucked up some things are, especially when taken to an extreme or perverted just enough to really make you think about it. Or, if you're especially lazy, by grossing people out with the splatteriest of gore, because squick is sometimes just as powerful as fear. And the thing about horror is that it's almost entirely subjective. Something that absolutely terrifies one person is basically nothing to the next. So there's no real catch-all form that'll make everyone piss themselves. So keep that in mind when I do come to an inevitable conclusion, because I really don't want to see anyone bragging about how brave they were in the comments, because I honestly do not care. Tell me something that did scare you instead. That's a far more interesting conversation to have. Also, I will be entirely honest with you guys, I love horror, but I'm a massive fucking baby about it. I'm the kind of person who has to peek at scary movies from behind a pillow to get through them, and if I'm seeing one in the theatres, I hide in my hoodie. Feel free to laugh at me, my friends certainly do. I laugh at me for it too, it's objectively funny. But it does mean I'm probably the least qualified person to talk about horror, which is also kind of funny. Or maybe it makes me more qualified. Who the fuck knows? I'm rambling and it's time to get back on subject. So the thing about the two movies I mentioned is that while they're both very different, neither one could keep up how scary they were for the longest time. I mean, The Conjuring 2 was 30ish minutes longer, but it was still actively scary for about as long as The Babadook was. And while no horror movie is non-stop scary, because the setup phase of the story is really important and you'd honestly just grow numb to the fear if it never let up, there were times, mostly in The Conjuring 2, where the scares just didn't do their job. You can probably at least partially attribute this to the longer runtime, as it calls for more content overall, and you're bound to have some misses here and there. But I think it's more than that. See, the scariest parts of the movie are around the end of the first act, when the old man's ghost is fucking with the family, mostly because the scenes are largely quiet and dark, so it means your imagination is hard at work, supplying you with possible scares and monsters all your own. One of the best scenes in the movie is when Janet goes downstairs to investigate a noise, sees the chair rocking on its own, and then runs back to hide under her blankets with something unseen chasing her. It's really tense and actually pretty scary, because you have no idea what the hell is even going to happen, especially in the moment she's hidden under the covers. And then the old man's ghost bites her and she screams and wakes up her family, and her mom gets mad, and then this happens.
Have you two been playing with this? Taking turns scaring the wits out of each other? No wonder I can't get a good night's sleep. No, I don't want to hear another word. Now get back to bed, the lot of you!
And it just stops being scary. Can you tell what it is that made it work yet? Don't worry, I'll give you another hint. The setup phase of The Babadook takes a bit longer, with the actual horror not starting until they read the book, and debatably not even then, since this part is largely just unsettling. See, the movie goes out of its way to establish the mundanity of Amelia's life and just how much nothing there is to it. The book is creepy, yes, but it doesn't become actually scary until it returns and starts threatening her. From there, there's a serious underlying sense of wrongness as Amelia slowly starts breaking down from the stress of raising her obviously neurodivergent child and her own unaddressed trauma and grief, and also the lack of sleep. The Babadook itself doesn't even show up until around halfway through the movie, and even then the horror comes mostly from Amelia's increasingly unhinged behaviour, as she freaks out at her son, hallucinates bugs, cuts the fucking landline with a knife, and eventually starts seeing the Babadook on TV and in the window of her neighbour's house. This is actually one of my favourite horror movies of all time. See, the actual horror of the movie comes from Amelia herself. acting as a conduit for the harm the babadook can cause, especially in how she's actively hurting her own son, and the fact that on your first watch through, you feel like she could snap at any moment and murder her own child. It's disturbing, and it keeps you on the edge of your seat as she gradually grows more and more dangerous to herself and others. I also love the ending, but for thematic reasons, as it's honestly just not very scary, and its main function is to resolve the theme of how grief and unresolved trauma can poison you into becoming something awful if you let it. The Conjuring 2, meanwhile, ends with the exorcist lady banishing the demon responsible for everything back to hell in a climactic battle of wills in a room full of crucifixes while her husband dangles over a big impaling stick. Yeah, it really didn't do it for me. Of the two movies, I'd say The Babadook is just better overall, though The Conjuring 2 is more classically scary, apart from the ending, I mean. Anyway, have you guessed what I think the secret to horror is yet? It's uncertainty. See, the thing about both movies is that they're the absolute scariest when they're being subtle about things. The scene I mentioned earlier, when Janet was being stalked by the ghost and then attacked in her bed, that was really good because the viewer had no idea what was going to happen to her, and so you get caught up in imagining just how bad it could get. Your imagination does the movie's work for it here, because you're given time and quiet to ponder it. It even stays scary when she gets bitten, because all you can think is a shocked "what the fuck" when this little girl is assaulted in her own bed. But the following scene, where the chest of drawers slams the door shut, it's just silly in comparison. There's nothing to imagine, and there's no real fear. See, a person's imagination is really their own worst enemy when it comes to horror. If you give people just enough for them to formulate the idea of something scary, your work is 90% done, because nothing you make can hold up to the horrors the human mind can conjure. That's not to say that actually revealing the scary thing can't be done well. There are plenty of games and movies that pull it off, but most of them still find a way to maintain a level of uncertainty when they do so. I think horror lives or dies on how well it can stoke the imagination, as it tends to work the best when it's simply giving you enough details to build your own fear. And this can take a lot of forms, from Silent Hill 2 making the entirety of reality uncanny and hostile and just untrustworthy, to Amnesia the Bunker, where every expedition away from the safe room is a massive risk, but it's still not as dangerous as staying still and bringing about your certain end. The trouble with The Conjuring 2, and I find this tends to be where horror can often fail, is that a lot of the really big horror moments, like the dog transforming into the Crooked Man or the confrontation with Valak, tend to be tension killers. Now that you know what's going on, it becomes less scary and becomes more of a spectacle. Horror actively forfeits a lot of its strengths when it goes too big too quickly. Like, there's this scene where Exorcist Lady is having a nightmare with the nun, and the nun's shadow creeps along the wall and then behind the portrait of itself, which is creepy, but then it grows fingers and runs at her, holding the painting forward and opening the painting's mouth, and it's just really fucking dumb, and it just stops being scary by going too big. By being too big and upfront while trying to be scary, it loses the element that makes it scary. A game that actually failed to learn this lesson was Outlast 2, which was significantly less scary than its predecessor, and it fails in a weirdly similar way to The Conjuring 2. See, the game is an entry in the genre of you're being chased and have all the defensive capabilities of a sugar cookie and a glass of milk, and so most of the horror relies on the feeling of helplessness. It's largely like the first game, which also left you completely defenseless and stuck with a bunch of murderous psychopaths. The problem with 2, however, is that it blows its load too quickly, because the moment you get caught by an enemy, it's an instant game over, wherein your character is horribly mutilated to death, and then the quick load kicks in and you put right back in it, and it just ruins the entire thing. See, the problem is that you've now seen the absolute worst the game has to offer, so the tension is completely gone from the situation. You can essentially get caught and killed with no consequence outside of the squick factor and the fact that you'll have to repeat the section, so it can't even generate any proper horror from this point on. There's no uncertainty to it. If you get caught, you will die and you will start the part over again with naught but a gory slap on the wrist, and it effectively kills the actual scariness of the game alongside the player. I think there's actually a deceptively simple solution to this problem. Don't make getting caught an instant kill. I'd actually slightly randomise the amount of times a single enemy would need to catch you to result in a game over, I think between 2 and 4 times, as the fact that you'd never know how many more chances you would get would be really good for keeping tensions high. You could even injure the character, slow down their movement, or add some other form of penalty to make things harder once they do escape, to give it some actual weight. The game could have been so much better if they just kept things from going to the absolute extreme from the word go. No matter how good the setup or premise is, once you know exactly what's going to happen, horror ceases to be scary. This is especially true for video games because unlike other mediums, they have fail states and require interactivity and often repetition. So the player will always be growing more and more familiar with the game, and therefore uncertainty is a dwindling resource. A good horror game is actually really hard to make because balancing for the challenge of the gameplay is really difficult, and players can very easily grow frustrated instead of scared if you don't keep that in mind. This is, incidentally, one of the many reasons I don't like the FNAF games, because they're just not scary, like at all. Don't let the Steam tags fool you, these aren't horror games, they're suspense. The thing about the FNAF series is that the horror is entirely based around jump scares, and saying a jump scare is effective horror is like waving an onion under someone's nose while you tell a sad story and saying, "Aha, you cried, that means the story worked." It's cheating is what it is, and the thing about the FNAF games is that you already know what's coming. I don't want to give the impression that I don't think jump scares can be done well, it's just that they very rarely are, and they're definitely not done well in Five Nights at Freddy's. The games explicitly train you to expect and deflect oncoming jump scares, so you're not actually scared, you're just tense and stressed. Alfred Hitchcock once explained that, in suspense, the public must be informed of what's coming, otherwise it's just a surprise. And jump scares are usually just surprises, where the surprise is something jumping out at you. But it's not really scary, you're just startled. And the FNAF games aren't surprises because they literally tell you the jump scare is coming and prepare you for it. They simply cannot be scary, all they can do is build and release tension, and while tension is important to good horror, it takes more than that to be good horror. And these games ain't it, chief. But do you know a game that was really scary, at least in one part? Resident Evil Village. The Resident Evil games are another horror series that's never really been particularly scary unless you're afraid of bad writing. But for a short period of time, Village actually managed to be the single scariest game I'd ever played, and it was entirely thanks to the fact that, for just a little while, it didn't play like a Resident Evil game. If you've played the game, then obviously you know I'm talking about the Beneviento House, but if you haven't, well, spoilers ahead. The Beneviento House is the single fucking scariest section of a game I've ever played, and the fact that it's in a Resident Evil game, a series best known for boulder punching, rescuing the president's daughter, and most recently, angry rednecks empowered by evil mold, makes that all the more impressive. And it achieves this by doing one simple thing: it makes you absolutely helpless. All throughout the rest of the game, you have access to weapons to fight with. Even when they're ineffective against enemies, like Lady Dimitrescu, they always act as a form of comfort. They allow you to feel some form of measured control over your situation. But you don't have your weapons in the dollhouse, not after this scary little doll takes them away in the dark and leaves you with a mannequin puzzle and your own hectic thoughts. You also don't fight anything in the dollhouse, at least not until the very end. In fact, until you're about halfway through the segment, you're not even under any form of threat. Of course, you don't know that going in. In fact, you actively have no idea what the hell is happening at all, and that's the absolute worst part of it. The dollhouse is interesting because you're left both figuratively and literally in the dark, and this is what makes it scary. The area slowly ramps up an underlying feeling of danger without actually putting you in any for an extended period of time. And basically everything it does is atmospheric. It's the oppressive silence, it's the locked doors, and the horrifying dark well it forces you to climb down into to find a key. It's the scared call from your wife on the phone and the crying baby in the distance. And all these things add together so that by the time the giant man-eating fetus monster appears in the morgue that's now stained with trails of blood, you're ready to piss yourself at the mere sound of The dollhouse is the only section of the game where the developers grab you by the neck and shake you and say, "Okay, motherfucker, you're playing this our way. You won't even know what the hell's coming next, but you better be fucking ready for it." And you have no choice but to agree and start hiding under beds and lockers because god damn this fucking baby! I played this section with a friend in the room, and we had to stop several times to calm down and prepare ourselves to continue. It was some of the best fun I've ever had with a horror game in my life. And my friend is nowhere near the scared little baby I am. She's so much better at handling it than me. This section is so effective, it's an honest-to-God relief to get to the end and have to fight a bunch of creepy possessed dolls. No other part of the game manages to even come close to how good this was, and it's a real shame it's as short as it is. I feel like it's a glimpse into what a fully finished PT could have been. There is one last thing that can ruin horror, but it's really rare, and I'm not convinced it's not just a me thing, because I can only think of one time it ever happened, and that was in It Chapter 2. The thing about the new It movies is that while they're pretty good, I found the first to be a hell of a lot scarier than the second, but the fault for that entirely stems from Part 2's opening scene. See, while the clown from It is scary and Bill Skarsgård is legitimately disturbing in the role, the movie kind of ruined itself for me by opening on a horror that's just too real for me. It Chapter 2 opens on a gay couple at a fair who get harassed and followed by a group of homophobic jackasses, and after one of the boys confronts them, the group mercilessly beats him unconscious in a brutally fucking hard to watch scene before they toss him over the side of this bridge and his boyfriend has to run to try to save him, only for Pennywise to show up and bite the guy's fucking heart out. And you know, I never thought I'd be relieved to see this fully demonic menace, but I literally said, "Oh thank God," out loud in the theatre when he showed up, because it offered me a strange distance from the horrible reality of the homophobia. I am both gay and trans, so the idea that someone could, at any time, decide either of those are reason enough for me to die is the background anxiety of my life, and it's something I actively work on not thinking about, even though it's a potential threat I have to keep in mind every time someone new finds out. This is true for basically every gay, trans, or queer person alive. We're constantly aware that someone, somewhere, wants us dead, and would happily see that desire fulfilled if given half the chance. And it's because of this that the rest of the movie just couldn't scare me, because I'd already been subject to the nightmare that is my reality, and there was literally nowhere to go but up from there. Like I said, I can't really think of another example like this, but I doubt I'm the only person who's experienced something along these lines. If you have, let me know in the comments, I'm genuinely curious. So yeah, that's that. I really do think that the key to good horror is cultivating that sense of uncertainty in the audience, in taking advantage of their own imaginations and allowing it to work for you. Or I guess in some cases, invoking the fear they keep repressed on a daily basis by reminding them of their own terrifying reality. Happy Halloween everyone. Comment your favourite horror or monster movie down below. I'd love to know what I should watch for Halloween this year. May your treats be many and your tricks few.